All right, welcome back. Today we are continuing to look at solving quadratic equations, but we are now looking at a second method that we have that we can use some of the time. So this method is called solving by the square root property. Now let's review just a bit what we did last time. Solving means finding the value for x that makes the equation equal to 0. So what number can we plug in for x that makes the equation true? Just a reminder, we almost always have two answers because when we think about the graph of our parabola, most of the time the parabola touches the x-axis in two places. And our first way of solving was to use factoring and the zero product property. So just a reminder of that, the zero product property means something times something equals 0. And so in this case, I have it equal to 0, but I don't have something times something, so I'm going to use the process of factoring to make it a product. So I'm listing my factors of -8, 1 and 8, 2 and 4. Because it's negative, I'm making something negative, and I'm looking for the pair that gives me a sum of -2. Well, I see -2 and 4 would give me a sum of +2, so I'm going to change the signs so that I would get my sum of -2. Therefore, the factors are x plus 2 and x minus 4 is equal to 0. Now that I have it as something times something equals 0, I'm going to break it apart and say that means that either x plus 2 is 0 or x minus 4 is 0. And then once I've done that, these are simple solving problems. And I'm going to find out that x can be -2, or in this case, x could be +4. So I have two solutions to this equation. If I plugged in a -2, or if I plugged in a +4, this equation would be true. That's our first method of solving using the factoring process that we learned a couple of chapters ago with quadratics. So our objective for today is to look at our second method of solving, and we're going to solve quadratics again, but we're going to look at some problems that allow for a different process. So look at the three problems below and tell me what you notice about each of those problems. So one thing I noticed is they all equal 0. That's a great start for zero product property. But another thing I notice is they are all just two terms. And when I look even more specifically about that, they're all missing the middle term. I'm going to suggest that that's called the B term because remember in standard form it goes A, B, C. And the B term is always the one with just the x. And if you'll notice, none of these have a term with just x. They've all got an x squared and a number term and then equal to 0. And so when we see a problem that is missing that middle B term, that allows us to use a shorter process called the square root process. So before we jump into that process, I want us just to get a little background knowledge. And so I've put a calculator up here because you're definitely going to need a calculator today. The first thing that I want us to recognize is when we solve these problems, just like before, most of the time we get two answers. And this may seem a little bit strange, but the way that we're going to solve this is this. If I have a problem that says x squared is equal to 49, then the way that I can solve that using a square root method is I can take the square root of each side. Remember, as long as I do the same thing to each side, I keep that equation the same. So taking the square root of something squared just makes that a value of x. However, when I use my calculator, you're going to type in the square root, which is right up here. It's the squared button, but it's written right above that. So we're going to hit the second button and then the squared button and then type in 49. If you have a different calculator than this one, you may need to type in 49 first and then access your square root button. Either way, when you do that, you get an answer. You should get an answer of 7. Now, that only gives us one answer. So, how can this give me two answers? Well, when we introduce our own square root, we're introducing that second answer by saying x could be positive 7 or it could be negative 7. You could see it written like that with the positive and negative, or you could see it written as the set of numbers positive 7 and negative 7. And the reason for that is when I come back and plug it into my original problem, if I take 7 squared, I do get an answer of 49. But if I take negative 7 squared, negative 7 times negative 7, I also get that answer of 49. Therefore, I want to make sure that I include both answers. So let's try another one. X squared is equal to 169. So we're going to introduce the square root on each side and get x is equal to, then we're going to type in, hit the second x squared button and then type in 169. And when I do that, I get an answer of 13, but I must remember I could have a positive 13 or a negative 13 as my answer. Okay, the third one, x squared is equal to negative 121. So I type in, or I introduce my square root, and I get x is equal to, and I take the second square root there, and I type in the negative 121. Uh-oh, what happens when you do that one? Do you get an error message? You should, because there's not a number that I can plug in when I square it and get a negative 121. If it's a positive number, positive times positive is always going to give me a positive. If it's a negative number, negative times itself is still going to give me a positive. Therefore, whenever I have an x squared is equal to a negative number, I know that there are no real solutions. And I can stop right there. But the nice thing about it is when you see that calculator tell you error message, that's another hint that there's no solution. So looking at the last one, without doing any work, we can say that this is a no real solution because it's an x squared equal to a negative number. All right, so now that we've got some background knowledge, let's do one more thing before we move on to solving. It really just adds one last step. For instance, on this one, if I had 7x squared is equal to 112, before I could introduce the square root, I need to get x squared by itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide each side by 7. So I'm going to end up with x squared is equal to, and in this case, 112 divided by 7 gives me an answer of 16. Once I get that x squared by itself, now I'm ready to finish. And so I would introduce my square root and I would say x is equal to positive and negative 4. Second one, just because we see negatives here doesn't mean that there's no solution, because to get x squared by itself, I'm going to divide by negative 3 on each side. And when I divide by negative 3, I get x squared is equal to negative 24 divided by negative 3. That's going to be a positive 8. So by dividing, I got rid of that negative number. Therefore, I can continue the problem. So on this one now, I'd like for us to take the square root of 8. And when I take the square root of 8, it doesn't come out to a nice whole number answer. In this unit, we're going to round to the nearest hundredth, so that's 2 places. So in this case, I got an answer of 2.828, and it continues on. But hundredth is 2 places, so that 8 tells me to round up, and so I'm going to say x is equal to positive and negative 2.83. All right, last but not least, on this one, to get the x squared by itself, I'm going to divide by negative 2. And I get x squared is equal to negative 6. And in this case, I can just stop and say this is a no solution. And the reason I know it's a no solution is because I got an x squared equal to a negative number, and we know that can never happen. So guys, you've really got most of the information you need now to solve, but let's just make sure that we're all clear. When we have equations that have no b term, that allows us to use the square root property. If we have a b term, we can't use the square root property because we can't get x squared by itself. So the square root property in this case, if I had a problem, 3x squared minus 5 is equal to 22. I notice there's no x term there, and so square root property is an option for me here. So I'm going to work on getting the x squared by itself by adding 5 to each side. And I end up with 3x squared is equal to 27. I'm going to divide each side by 3, and I get x squared is equal to 9. So I'm looking for what numbers I can multiply by themselves to get 9. So I'm going to introduce the square root on each side, and I end up with x is equal to positive and negative 3. Again, that can be written like that, or it could be written as the set of numbers positive 3 and negative 3. On to the next one. I'm going to start by adding 19. I notice there's no x term or b term, and so I'm going to start by adding 19, and I end up with negative 5x squared is equal to 163. Then I'm going to divide by negative 5, and I get x squared is equal to negative 3, 32 and 3, wait a minute, 32 and 2/5. Um, at this point, it really doesn't matter because if x squared is equal to a negative, there is no way that I can solve that one. And so in this case, there is no solution. All right, finally, I've noticed there is no b term, so the square root property is a good property to use in this one. So I'm going to start by adding the 125 to the other side, and I end up with 5x squared is equal to 125. Divide each side by 5, and I get x squared is equal to 25. This is one I can continue on, so I take the square root of each side, and I get x is equal to positive and negative 5. So in summary, at this point, we've now learned two ways that we can solve quadratic equations. We almost always have two answers. Remember, there are those specific occasions where we don't. But if I were to look at this first one and ask which method would I use, I think this one would be a great one for the square root method. However, if I look at the second one, because I have a b value, square root method would not be an option for me on this one. So at this point, I would have to use factoring for the second equation. Guys, I hope that helps you out. Today, your assignment is on a Google form. And so go ahead and click on that. You may do that one more than one time. If you make some mistakes and would like to go back and check it, you can resubmit. But have a great day. Remember, I'm available all day. Just send me an email or a Google Hangout and we'll set up an appointment time. Or I'm always available between the hours of 10 and 12 in the morning. And so you can, I'll get back with you very quickly if you try to reach me during those times. Guys, I hope you have a great day. We've got one more way to learn how to solve quadratics, and that will be our last major topic for this year. I hope you have a great day, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help you. Bye.